going to give you a few insights about how we can use sensor technology in order to improve traffic flows, both in freeways and in cities, based on local interactions, and also how we can use bottom-up approaches potentially to address global climate change. So we've all read about climate change and global warming, how it's debated, but there's quite a bit of evidence for it. And this is a problem that we haven't solved yet efficiently. So what we have to expect is basically water rise all over the world, and even if it's just for 5 meters, that will really have a huge impact on a number of countries like the United States, Asia, Europe, and Venice as well, to give just a few examples. And so our current approach is regulation. We would sit together, the governments of the world, and try to negotiate a law, a contract, whatever, and that would be implemented on a global scale, basically telling companies and countries and citizens what to do. However, negotiations have been going on for many years now, and this law is still not in action. And in the consequence, basically, it happens that we still have a lot of pollution, we have a lot of CO2 emissions, and we are far away from the goals of CO2 emission reduction that we wanted to reach. So the question is this top-down approach, where basically there would be something like a world parliament that decides what everyone has to do, is this maybe not so efficient as we expected it to be, and are there any alternatives? Because we don't have the time to wait, we have to act, we have to come up with solutions. I'll come back to this in the end of my talk. And altogether, I'd like to argue for a new paradigm. And this paradigm basically says that if the complexity of the system is large, then you have to give more autonomy to the different components of the system to achieve your goal. And that means you need to have a sufficient level of bottom-up involvement. Just telling people you shouldn't travel anymore, you should not use your car anymore, won't do it. And in fact, we see now a trend towards decentralization. So classically we had traffic control centers to take decisions for the entire city or for the entire freeway. While today we have new kinds of technologies which are based on local interaction, local information exchange, such as car-to-car communication or car-to-infrastructure communication. And so this is actually on the way, and it seems to be superior to what we have done in the past. So let's look into the problems that can be solved in this way. One of these problems is actually phantom traffic jams, and here some trajectories. As you can see, the free traffic flow that we have on the left is basically giving rise to a traffic jam. The cars obviously are stopped for some time. And so the question is, how can we get rid of this annoying phenomenon? Here's a video that I took in Egypt, in Cairo, and you'll be a witness of the emergence of a traffic jam on the left. And there are no traffic lights, also not downstream. So now you can actually see the stop-and-go phenomenon. And you see a few cars coming in on the right. And these are the cars that basically create small perturbations to the flow. As I explained last time, these small perturbations are amplified and eventually give rise to the stop-and-go traffic. So this is something that we want to understand in terms of models, and once we have an understanding of the phenomenon, we can start to come up with solutions. Congestion patterns are actually surprisingly complex. So when we started to do traffic modeling, many people thought, okay, maybe there is a bottleneck, and behind the bottleneck there are queues of vehicles because there's not enough capacity to serve them all, and the queue grows over time. That was kind of the understanding. And others were thinking about this periodic stop-and-go waves, but such kind of complicated structures were basically not imaginable to most scientists. There was not the data actually to look into this structure, and as the data became available, scientists were pretty amazed, if not shocked. And I should say, if I had seen that in the beginning when I started to do traffic science, I would probably have decided to go for another subject because this looks just too complicated to come up with a mathematical model, you would think. But by that time, I had a reputation to lose, and so we had to show that we can understand this, and actually we succeeded. So what we did is basically we looked for repetitive patterns, for elementary patterns in the congestion pattern that I showed you before. So to understand basically those complicated congestion patterns as a composition from elementary patterns, and these are the elementary patterns. So top left is a moving localized cluster, as some people call it. In the middle, a pinned localized cluster. That you see that this stops at a certain location of the freeway, doesn't move anymore. There's an interesting thing that happens before. We call this the boomerang effect. Where in the beginning the platoon of vehicle moves forward and then turns around. Top right, stop-and-go traffic. Bottom left is oscillating congested traffic, and bottom right is homogeneous congested traffic. And so the question is, what are conditions under which these kind of phenomena occur? Can we come up with models for this? And in fact, one of those models that describes all those phenomena, these elementary patterns, is the intelligent driver model. And it's a micro model which looks at single cars. It has two equations. One equation of motion, which is the first one, basically says that change of location of vehicle alpha with time is given by the speed, and that's trivial. But then the question, how to model the change in speed, second equation, the acceleration. And somehow that depends on the distance, on the velocity, on the relative velocity, delta V. And there is another quantity in here, which is this quantity S star, which represents the desired distance as a function of the speed and the relative velocity. And it's basically chosen in a way that you would create accident free driving. Okay, so this can be simulated, and with models like these, and also some macroscopic models, you find patterns such as the ones that are shown over here. And in fact, we have the moving localized cluster with pinned localized clusters, stop-and-go waves, oscillating congested traffic, and homogeneous congested traffic. Even though this simulation was done with a very simple model, of course, for example, we have reflected here that there are cars and trucks, with different driving styles, and all these kind of things. So, despite all the simplifications that we made, we find kind of these ideal, typical elementary patterns. And in fact, it's even possible to understand the parameter regimes under which these different kinds of patterns can exist in an analytical way. So we call these diagrams phase diagrams. And what it shows is the upstream traffic flow on a freeway, Q up on the y-axis. And we're looking here basically at the freeway with an on-ramp. Okay? The on-ramp creates a flow delta Q. That is the inflow. It basically takes away a certain capacity from the freeway. I mean, that capacity that's used for the inflow is not available for those vehicles anymore that come from the upstream part of the freeway. Okay, so it's basically delta Q is a bottleneck strength, you could say. But at the same time, it's the inflow. And so basically, if you add this up, Q up plus delta Q, that's the total traffic volume downstream of the on-ramp. Okay? And so what you see is as the total traffic volume increases, so if we go from bottom left to top right, yeah, traffic volume increases, so we go from free traffic to congested kinds of traffic. Yeah? So red and brown is congested traffic. And you can see two diagrams here, and that's interesting. And the reason for this is that traffic flows are metastable or bistable. So you can have different kinds of congestion states or traffic states depending on the initial conditions. So it's history dependent, right? And they have different outcomes, and what you see here is there's small perturbations, then you end up with the phase diagram like the one on the right, on the left-hand side, and you have large perturbations, and you find the stuff on the right-hand side. And if you're not able to distinguish in your empirical data small and large sizes of perturbations, then you get an overlay of those two phase diagrams. And so basically in a certain parameter area you could have different outcomes. Yeah? But not any outcomes, particular outcomes. Yeah? The interesting thing is that you also see this stripe of yellow and orange, PLC and MLC. These are the localized traffic patterns, and they can only exist for large perturbations. So they're really triggered by those large perturbations. Okay, so there are, by the way, other advantages of such a picture, which is that you can classify different kinds of traffic models. Because over time, more or less every scientist who's been working in this field has come out with known traffic flow model. And so then there were people who were trying to narrow it down to the one right model. So they were looking for empirical data, this kind of cross-sectional flow data on the one hand, but also car following data, so much more sophisticated micro-level data. And we're calibrating those different models. And then after this calibration, we're using the second half of the data set to validate those models, to see how powerful they are in terms of prediction for a data set that the model has been calibrated for. And then it turned out that the models didn't perform clearly different. So it happened basically that they more or less had the same amount of error. So, of course, formally you could say, okay, one was slightly better than the others. But you couldn't really guarantee this is the one correct model. So basically that was a bit surprising, and you couldn't single out the one correct model. And so in the end, what people learn to do is to classify traffic models according to the macroscopic collective traffic patterns that would emerge for different flow conditions. Because some traffic models don't have all those patterns. Some just produce one or two patterns. Some perhaps produce more than those patterns that we find in reality. So you can basically classify models according to diagrams that they produce. And then each phase diagram basically represents a class of models. And then we compare the theoretical phase diagrams that are produced by so-called chapter models with the phase diagram that we find empirically. And this really narrows out, say, 70–80% of models, and you stay with models that fall into the correct class of phase diagrams. And then what you basically do is, okay, you either choose the simplest one that allows you to do analytical calculations, or you choose one that is detailed enough to be used for adaptive cruise control systems, where you don't want to risk that the oversimplification is going to create accident or something like this. So, depending on the purpose, you would use a simple or not so simple. So the nice thing is actually that the empirical data are well consistent with the phase diagrams that I showed you right now. So you can clearly see clusters of certain kind of traffic states, localized clusters in orange, for example, pink localized clusters in blue, the stop and go stuff in red, black. And so there is a nice agreement, and in fact, we've even been able to calculate the extension of the congestion patterns in space and time. So these are predictive models. Even though these are nonlinear, complex models, there is now actually an analytical theory of these kinds of traffic patterns, and this is a powerful theory, so a big success story of complexity science, I would say. Now, once we understand the problem, we can start to look for solutions, and we've been working on these adaptive cruise control systems together with Volkswagen. So you see this car in front, it will brake and then accelerate. We'll see the classical adaptive cruise control in the back. You see, it goes much closer to the car that brakes, and then it takes much more time for the classical adaptive cruise control to accelerate again. So our system was the one towards us that made the second car on the left, and that behaves much more as you would expect a car to drive in such kind of situations, right? So, to the left, this is the one that basically we decide, so it keeps more distance while the first car brakes, but then also it accelerates much more quickly. Now the interesting point is that cars are becoming intelligent now. Of course, you can equip them with all sorts of sensors. And there is onboard data acquisition, which we could call perception. There's inter-vehicle communication. But the question is, what is the traffic state that my car is in? And maybe you cannot determine this clearly from the data that you can measure, the kind of distance data, acceleration data, and so on. So it could be one of several congestion patterns if you just rely on your own measurements. So you would like to exchange information with cars in the neighborhood to learn more about the situation in this area. That's why we need inter-vehicle communication. And so basically you determine the traffic state in a cooperative way. And that creates something like a cognition of the situation you're in and allows you to take adaptive decision making. Of course, the driver would be informed, but also we can create traffic assistance systems. Now, in fact, there are a number of different data sources that are merged in these kind of systems. So we have stationary detectors, we have inter-vehicle communication, we have GPS sensors and acceleration sensors and so on and so on. So today, more and more of these sensor data are being integrated to get a better and better picture of the situation you're in. And then the question is, what do you do in what kind of situation? And maybe you remember that in the intelligent driver model, there were a number of parameters like acceleration, deceleration, time gap also between cars. All of this is being recorded. And so we're changing these parameters by a certain prefactor, which most of the time is 1, but in certain situations could be 0.7 or 2 or 0.5, as you can see over there. So in free traffic flow, we're just imitating a natural driver's behavior. And in fact, can be adjusted to your personal driving style. Then, when approaching the upstream end of congestion, you see that the deceleration is changed. So you want to brake a little bit smoothly so there wouldn't be a risk of an accident. Then, on the other hand, say the light blue, you can see that the time gap between cars is reduced. There's this factor 0.5 there. So that creates more capacity. But on the other hand, this reduction of time gap also destabilizes the traffic flow. So that small perturbation would actually be amplified. In order to avoid that, you also have to increase acceleration. Right? So you have more capacity but stable flow. And so if you implement this, actually, as I already showed you last time, we can overcome this annoying stop-and-go traffic. So what we have on the right-hand side is, by the way, the coffee meter, and that Martin Driver, who programmed this, is very proud of it, of course. This is a measurement device that measures abrupt change in acceleration. So if it spills over, that means it's not a comfortable driving situation, right? Now, we also invented this car that can be turned into a helicopter. And that allows us to see what are the reasons for the stop-and-go traffic. And the perturbations are basically created by the few cars that want to get on the freeway. We accelerate the presentation, but the inflow stays the same all the time, still stop-and-go traffic. Then we turn on the traffic assistance system. Right? It's based actually on a particular kind of adaptive boost control. It means really local interaction only. And the adaptive boost control, however, has been designed in a way, and interactions have been chosen in a way that the interaction would create a collective effect, a beneficial collective effect also for the other cars. That means even if you have only a 20% equipment rate, all the cars would benefit from this. As we see over here. So in the middle, you can see as the percentage of equipped vehicles goes up, there's a dramatic drop in the temporal extension of the stopway that we can see on the left, and you can see also there that with no equipped vehicles, you have a large congestion. With 10% equipped vehicles, it is dramatically reduced, and with 20% equipped vehicles, there's almost no congestion anymore. When you look at travel times and fuel consumption, also the effects are very large. In fact, a small deficit in capacity is actually producing really tremendous increases in travel times. The travel times could basically multiply by a factor of 2 or 5, sometimes even more. So these increases in travel times can be largely reduced.
This means that all the cars should have this device.
No.
No, 20%.
As you can see over here, the single
that is too small. That is the percentage.
Yeah, that's percentage. So 100 is on the right, and you see it becomes pretty effective starting with 20%. So, you know, it's possible for a company like Volkswagen, given that they really have a mass market, to reach that level within a few years. And that was very important because in the past, many strategies would work only if all the cars would be equipped. Now, one of the open questions still is, how do you determine the location of the congestion front? And that has been done also by means of inter-vehicle communication. So you can see, you can determine the trajectories of vehicles through these congestion patterns, and there are certain areas where the cars accelerate, and there are other areas where they accelerate. And from these points, you can basically collectively determine again the location of the fronts. And that allows you then to switch basically the driving style as needed. So you can see that over here. So collective measurement, collective intelligence also in a sense, now it's important to be able to solve these problems based on local interactions, but it can be done. And then another question was, how do we make inter-vehicle communication effective? Because the communication ranges are just about, say, 300 meters around a single car, and in the beginning there wouldn't be many cars who also have inter-vehicle communication devices in them. So there's nobody to talk to, you know, you cannot communicate your knowledge to others. Now, it turns out that if you pass on your information, that's kind of the red triangle, to the opposite direction of motion, now, it's just a matter of time until an equipped vehicle passes by, so you hand over your information. That vehicle carries on this information upstream and then passes it back to your driving direction. And if you do it this way, then starting from 3% of equipped vehicles, this kind of communication becomes useful. So that's other regarding kind of information. So if you want to have the information, you have to collaborate with the opposite flow of vehicles. Okay, so this is a way how we could actually address traffic flow problems on freeways. And in many cases, you wouldn't have to build additional lanes or additional roads. You would just have to manage space more efficiently with modern information and communication technology. Of course, we cannot infinitely increase capacity, but no, it's probably a more environmental friendly way of overcoming congestion problems than the classical approaches. So from that point of view, it's the smart approach. And the question is, can we also do something in city centers? Not just on freeways cutting through the city. And we'll have to see. So urban traffic flows are actually even much more challenging than freeway traffic flows. We'd like to have better mobility, less pollution, less noise, and less traffic, obviously. But this is the reality now. Urban gridlock. And it can be really terrible. As you know, you can easily spend half an hour in the traffic jam. By now we have a much better information system. So, you know, in the morning before you start going to work, look up the web page and would tell you so and so much congestion on these streets or not. But congestion is still there. You know, you could decide maybe to go later if your employer allows you to do that. And in fact, it has improved the traffic flow situation. But the question is, why are we not better than this? In fact, cells in our body, with millions of cells, they're doing a much better job. In these cells, we have the nucleus. And basically, this nucleus requires a lot of resources. These resources are transported from the membrane of the cell towards the nucleus. So it's pretty much the situation as we have it in the morning, where everyone wants to go into the city. In fact, cells also have an infrastructure for this kind of transportation. It's the microtubuli. And along these microtubuli, as you can see them on the top right, these vesicles are being transported. But how do the cells manage to avoid congestion? And actually, they do manage to do this, because if there were congestion in our cells, we would all be dead. Our bodies wouldn't work. And in fact, there are some diseases where the sufficient transport doesn't break down, where there is congestion in the cells. These are terrible diseases. You don't want to have them. So, actually, there are a number of tricks. I didn't want to go into all these details, but there is a purification process, so substances that we don't really need are taken out on the way. Then there is a merging process, so the vesicles merge to form bigger vesicles, and that improves the ratio between volume and surface, or between what you can transport and the mutual obstruction. And then finally, it seems that there is not a continuous transportation process towards the nucleus, but you stay in a certain distance to the nucleus, and then once you have, say, a green light to go, nobody knows exactly how it works, but then this vesicle would move very quickly. Yeah? So not everyone is going at the same time, slowly, but instead, you wait in a certain distance, and then once you have the green light, you go quickly. Anyway, so the question is, can we do a much better job in cities if we have a different kind of approach? If our cells can do it, why couldn't we do it? And this is going to kind of video that I often use to inspire people that, wow, it could work. There is no traffic lights here, no policemen, and it's a lot of diversity, There's donkeys, camels, pedestrians, cars, trucks, buses, everything. And it just works miraculously. And the reason is very simple. The design is right. So you have this one-dimensional flow in front, and in the back you have the opposite flow. But in between there is a small buffer that allows you to adjust your speed. So you would find a gap in the flow and use it. And it's easy to get in through, one line of traffic. There were 2 or 3 or 4 lines, forget about it. But, just having one line of traffic, then you can use gaps as opportunities to cross. So could we scale that up, to city scale? Could we come up with a flexible traffic control that would be able to adjust complicated street designs, not the Manhattan kind of design, which is easy to optimize, but most European cities are just messy in terms of their structure. And then there are particular events such as Olympic Games, and soccer games, and whatever, So you want to be able to deal with all this, with accidents, and with building sites, and how would we do that? Well, at that time, I said, you know, let's start from scratch. I was interested in finding out, was it possible to come up with a self-organization principle that would basically coordinate traffic flows. And I was interested in whether this would be superior to our today's traffic light control. But, you know, the first moment the ambition was just to find a self-organizing approach. And for this, we first had basically to represent your street network in your computer. So we'll represent the street network by a graph, a mathematical graph, and then you give certain capacities to the links and to the nodes, and you have to specify the dynamics on the links. In this case, we've used a very simple model, the so-called micro-wisdom model, which is just representing flow conservation. No vehicle just disappears nowhere or drops from habit, which usually doesn't happen. And so the other element that we did was we assumed a flow density diagram that was actually triangular. And the reason for this is A, it's good enough, apparently. B, it allows you to do a number of calculations. I think I've taken out really the busy slides, the ones with the heavy mathematics on it. But the Leibniz model is a partial differential equation. It turns out if you want to solve this numerically, it's more difficult than you would think, because Leibniz models produce shock waves, that means discontinuities in density and speed. And this is something that your numerical procedure doesn't like. So in order to have a reasonable approximation, you have the very small time steps, and that makes your simulation inefficient, and you know, and then you cannot simulate a large city anymore. So what you can do though is you can analytically integrate the partial differential equation, assuming the triangular flow relationship, and then you get delayed differential equations, so no partial differential equations anymore, and these can be handled much more easily. And here actually some relationships, so you see in the lower formula over there, a minus ti, so this is the delay time, it's of course time dependent. So it's really a very interesting mathematical problem. And the next thing that you have to do is basically specify what happens at the intersections and at the nodes. And of course, there ought to be flow conservation again, so some kind of Kirchhoff's law. And yeah, it's not that trivial, I should say, but it still can be done. And one thing that really jumps into your eye over here is the minimum function over here. Yeah? Now this is very important because it tells you that you can easily lose a lot of capacity in the system. Actually, a similar thing happens even on freeways. So when the traffic flow breaks down, the effective road capacity drops by about 30%. That means at the time during the rush hour when we need to have all your capacity available, you're losing capacity. The very same road cannot transport as many vehicles anymore. So the adaptive cruise control system basically keeps up that capacity that you had before. Yeah? Now the question is, if we have a similar problem over here, just much worse, because there's so many more things you can do wrong. At every single intersection you can make mistakes and lose capacity by lack of coordination. Now, how would we be able to reactivate this capacity by reaching coordination? That's kind of the challenge. And you can see over here why the minimum function occurs. Because if you have this turning flow over here, if just one of those nodes is crowded, you cannot have the other roads served. So that's how the minimum function comes about. Now the next thing you have to do is to code your intersection designs, and each intersection is different. So the one on the left hand has this kind of mathematical graph representation. It's pretty messy already. So if you would tell your PhD student do a model of Barlano, she would do that by hand, to be sure it takes many years. But fortunately, by now, there is good data about intersection designs and everything about cities. And so a talented computer students loads this into a computer program and turns that automatically into an intersection design, actually a design of the entire road network of the city. And then we still need to take into account traffic lights. And we do that with a prefactor, which is representing permeability. So permeability is 1 when there's a green light. Permeability is 0 when there's a red light. Okay, so there are pretty many elements, as you can see, of this model, only to get started. Yeah? So it's really a complicated problem, and I should tell you that it was one of the most difficult projects I ever did. And I'm somebody who always likes to have intuition, imagination of the processes going on in the system. And it was very difficult for me to imagine all this. Also, given that you have opposite flows, and that means time delays that are different between this flow and that flow, and these time delays are variable. It's not just a time delay differential equation system with fixed delays. It's just a nightmare, really. Of course, as your traffic jam grows behind the red line, the delay grows as well. So everything is just time dependent, interdependent. So it's really a nightmare. But you have young brains, so it's just the right time to do these kind of problems. Of course, once you have your first gray hair, forget about it. So you have to be quick. So, and at that time, it was Stefan Lemmer, my PhD student, who was dealing with this. And he was doing pretty well. He just wrote me an email yesterday that the implementation in Dresden has been finished, and they're just starting their tests, so it became a real-life implementation. Okay, so what's the problem? I already indicated coordination of traffic lights is the challenge, and here just 2 of them. We'd like to have a green wave, of course, so we wouldn't like to stop the tunes of vehicles several times. There are so many things that you can do wrong. It could be non-optimal spaces, it could be different cycle times, it could be stochastic switching or whatever. Almost everything you do is wrong, unfortunately. And it's useful, therefore, to get an intuition of the different kinds of situations that we can have in the city. And I actually identified 4 regimes. I call the first one the gauges, or free flow low density regime. Just imagine at night. So basically there are more or less never 2 vehicles arriving at an intersection at the same time. And then you do first come, first serve. So you basically make sure you turn the traffic light green whenever a vehicle arrives. It's more or less the situation represented in this video over here. It's already a little bit too much traffic, but anyways, pretty much this first come, first serve principle. Unfortunately, this is not the kind of situation that we have all day. So traffic volume will increase, and it will happen that 2 or 3 vehicles arrive at the same time, and we cannot let them go at the same time because we don't want to have any accidents. So we need to prioritize, and the question is, how do we do this? It's a little bit unstable, huh? So let's try a little bit longer. So what happens is that what happens is that two vehicles are formed. And you would think that's a bad thing, but in fact it's not. And for some time I actually thought it wouldn't be nice if we had a technology that would just implement first come, first serve, and create a gap in the intersection for the moment in time where you arrive at that intersection, and just adjust your speed a little bit to be there at the right time. And actually there are research projects that try to do exactly this, until I eventually understood, oh, no, it's actually not the best way of managing your capacity. Because you have a higher capacity if you serve the tunes of vehicles. The traffic flow is beyond a certain threshold, serving cars individually, like the first come, first serve, would not use your capacity well. You would lose a lot of capacity. So having the tune is good because once you give a green light, you can serve many cars within a very short time period. You don't have to wait for the next vehicle to arrive. You don't have to switch traffic lights and all this. So what you want to have then is a green wave. And in fact, the simulation over here is showing the situation. See, green light is given down there, and then a green light that was also up there. And same thing now, all the vehicle flows from left to right and right to left. Okay, so that can be done. But unfortunately, during the rush hour, traffic flow will grow even further. And will sooner or later reach capacity, most likely, so in most cities. And even go beyond. So what can you do? Do you have to give up? Never give up. Never ever give up. You're a scientist, you don't need to fancy yourself. So you have to be innovative. It turns out that in many cases we have actually 4 phases, say. And you need the 4 phases because of the left turning. If you disallow for turning left, you just need 2 phases. That means rather than having to wait 3/4 of a cycle time, vehicles would only have to wait half of the cycle time. So we can serve many more vehicles. Of course, those who want to go left, they would have to go 3 times right. But if you don't do that all the time, this is a more efficient way of organizing it. And while in Europe, people would say, okay, you're crazy, you cannot just forbid left turning. But Americans can do that, See, between 7 and 9 a.m. and between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m., it's just not allowed. I saw that in Washington, I believe. So, be innovative, think beyond the institutional settings that we have. And you could also say, okay, if we don't turn left at certain times, why don't we use the left turning lane for traffic that goes straight? So we could use that capacity to increase the capacity even more. And we could even have a unidirectional flow, as is shown down there. So we wouldn't lose the lane for left turning. And this again for European sounds pretty crazy, but then if you go to the Golden Gate Bridge, it's normal, it happens every day that in the morning most of the days are being used inbound into San Francisco. Well, in the evening, most of the days are being used outbound, out of San Francisco. That means the lane used is variable over the time of the day. So why shouldn't we do that? I mean, also with new technology coming up, that can be more and more easily organized. So we should use capacities much more flexibly. Then the question is, okay, if we can reduce 4 phases to 2 phases, couldn't we just have 1 phase? And that basically means no traffic lights at all. And in fact, well, you can think of designs where you have rotary traffic, and many cities are now doing this, and it works pretty well up to a certain capacity. It's not the solution for everything. It's a good solution for most intersections, or for many at least. We could even think of entirely different city designs. Go away from these rectangular designs. I don't know why we thought a city needs to look like this. Of course, it's practical, but why do we need to build cities in this way? Why couldn't we do it in a different way? So if you start to think more freely about it, then you could come up with entirely different city designs. No traffic lights at all. Just much more capacity. And then there's a 4th phase where you are beyond capacity. Things are heavily congested. The question is, do we finally have to give up? No, of course not. Of course not. God forbid. Now, the issue is that now the gaps in the crowded roads is kind of the scary source. So you manage the gaps. Yeah? You switch your traffic lights to make sure that your gaps are always moving. And this is what we're doing over here. So cars and gaps, in a sense, are exchanging their role for the traffic light control. So you see, we keep those gaps moving. Because that's the only way of finally getting the cars to go. Okay, so in principle, we could say now we understand the 4 different phases of the traffic flows in cities, and the next thing we would have to do is find conditions under which we have to switch between this and that kind of traffic state, identify the traffic state in the first place, and then find suitable switching or transition routes. Okay, but there's a much easier approach, much simpler approach. As you can see over here, at this bottleneck, we find oscillatory flows of pedestrians. And it looks like there was a traffic light, or a policeman, or something, somebody who is kind of coordinating the traffic flows of pedestrians there, but it's not. This happens by self-organization based on a pressure principle, so people are accumulating on the side that's not moving, the pressure grows, the pressure will eventually stop the flow from the other side, the flow will turn in its direction, and so you go back and forth and back and forth. So couldn't we use a similar pressure principle to prioritize flows? So the idea is basically to interpret an intersection as a bottleneck in the flow, but with many more flow directions. But have a self-organization principle and turn that into traffic light switching. I mean, have the traffic flows control the traffic lights rather than the other way around. And in fact, this is working pretty well. We've been comparing the self-control principle with established traffic light controls at intersections like cycle-biased or gap-out control, and it's working pretty well. So they're pretty reasonable traffic jams, vehicle platoons behind the red lights, but the superiority of this approach becomes visible only through the coordination between different intersections. Before we go to the coordination, let's look at the single intersection first, which are on the top left. And the question is, why can this bottom-up self-control be so efficient? Well, it's because the top-down approach requires a lot of information. Even if you have that information, you must process it. You need to go through all the possible traffic light controls, and you can change a lot. You can change green times, the cycle times, phase lengths, the order of phases, and all sorts of things, you know. So you have an explosion of possibilities, and you cannot really go through all these possibilities in real time. So we have to make a simplification. And people say, oh, that's synchronized the intersections. Yeah? So each intersection is operating in a cyclical way, in a periodic way, then we can synchronize the intersection, and there will be a perfect coordination, let's say, here. But let's see what happens over here. If we have really a constant inflow into this intersection. The interesting point is, suddenly we have services where the main road is served 2 times, while the side road is served 1 time. No engineer seems to have ever thought about this. We say, okay, within 1 cycle, every road has to be served 1 time. Why this? And in principle, you could also allow to change the order of service every time. Why not? So why periodic? So basically, what seems to be a genius approach was have a cyclic service and to synchronize it is a very restrictive intent. So you lose out a lot of good solutions, actually. And the superiority of this self-control approach is even bigger if you have a variability in the inflow. So you can see the classical fixed time control has pretty much an explosion in the Q lanes, but our approach, which is called now the combined program over here, can handle it pretty well. Why is it called combined program? Of course, we basically apply 2 rules. Local rules. The rule number 1 is minimize waiting times or travel times of all the cars that are approaching a particular intersection. We measure the outflow but also the inflow into these road sections. So we would make a short-term prediction. And we would know, in a few seconds there will be a vehicle platoon arriving at that intersection. So can't we clear the vehicle queue behind the red light before, so that vehicle platoon wouldn't have to stop, just could go without stopping. So it would save a lot of waiting time. And we would do that most of the time, but those situations where the queue in one of the road sections grows so long in percentage that there is a risk of a spillover effect. So, the queue could disturb the traffic flow at the neighboring intersection. If that would happen, we quickly produce large-scale congestion in a very short time. So we have to avoid this. We have to be friendly to our neighbors, basically. If they do the same thing, I will not suffer a spillover effect. So this is the kind of approach. So if you find this long queue, the critical queue length exceeded, then you first clear this queue before you go back to the minimization of travel times. Okay, and that works very well. It works very well also for these arterials with many intersections. And as you can see over here, we made it pretty difficult for our approach because we had non-constant distances between the intersections. Yeah? And given that you have two directional flows, that really messes up things quite a bit. So what you can do is you can try to create a green wave in the classical way, as you can read it in a book on traffic light control, or we can use our approach, which is on the right hand. And oh no, sorry, I'm mixing up things. The lower curve is our self-control approach, and the upper curve is the green wave approach. So the question is, how can we manage to be better than a green wave? And the reason is that the classical green wave is actually made for one particular direction. Like in the morning, towards down, in the evening, outbound. While our self-control approach is fair with regard to the directions. I think there will be another plot coming up, but here you can see that we have this nice coordination of flows if we have several intersections. And this coordination is really important to have an advantage over the way we're doing things today. Yeah, here's the plot that I already indicated. So you can see the gray bands going from lower left to upper right. These are the green waves. Yeah? But if you have to go the opposite way, you see that you can lose a lot of time. You will be stuck more or less at every single intersection. It can be terrible for you. So you're not just doing what everyone else does. While the combined controller, as you can see, is also creating green waves, but these green wave bands are much smaller and more flexible, more variable. And it turns out that this is doing a much better job also for the opposite flow direction. Here we're not giving priority to one flow direction. We just say every car has the same wave, and we're trying to do the best job for everyone. And the whole thing also works for situations where we have a network of intersections. So again, our approach seems to be superior. So all of this is still pretty theoretical. But for these theoretical scenarios, we really get nice green waves and islands of coordination, as you can see it on the right. Now these islands of coordination are pretty flexible, and so they're really adjusting themselves to the situation that is out there. Not to a typical or average situation, but to that situation that is actually there. And that's why this approach is superior. Now, let's challenge ourselves a little bit more. Let's go away from theoretical scenarios towards scenarios with a real road network and real data to calibrate the model. And this was done actually in Dresden, where I worked at that time. And it's just the center of Dresden. Dresden Mitte is the center. There is a train station. The touristic area is just on the right, and you can see it's a pretty messy, non-Manhattan road network that you can see over there. And what makes things worse is that you have so many public transportation lines cutting across this area in different ways, and you'd like to prioritize public transportation. But if you do this, the green waves that they operate at the moment, of course they had public bids and went for the best technological solution that was offered, and I think costs several millions actually. So they have this green wave principle implemented, and they even have an adaptive traffic light control. But they would like to prioritize public transportation. And if they would do that, it would mean that whenever a tram or a bus arrives, they would give you the green light and stop everyone else. But if you do that, your greenways are completely destroyed, completely messed up. And if that happens, you have really a monster congestion in the entire city for almost the entire day. So you cannot prioritize public transport based on it. So when we went to see them, the traffic center, they said, okay, there is an area where we're not entirely happy with now. Here you can show how good you are. So they didn't have a solution for this one, and they said, okay, let these crazy scientists work on this. Yeah? Okay, now one important point here is that oversaturated traffic is a little bit like oversaturated vapor. So a slight perturbation can create a condensation process. And condensation process here is the formation of congestion. So if you just let the tram or bus go whenever it likes, it would cause this condensation. So this is not the right approach to prioritize public transportation. What we do instead is we give a bus a weight of 30, say, 30 vehicles, 30 cars. And if you do this, the bus or the tram might have to stop for a few seconds, but you don't feel that as a passenger of the tram or the bus. And altogether, as we will see, it will give a very good service to public transportation without messing up coordination of the vehicle flows. But if you give a too high weight, say 100, an equivalent of 100 cars, it turns out this would actually mess up the traffic flow. So you need to find the right weight, basically. If we do that, now we can compare the two scenarios, the current traffic light control with ours. Ours is on the right-hand side, and see we have less congestion and trams are going earlier. This is exactly what we want to have. The only thing that you will ask, of course, is did they just cut out the right moment where it looks so nice to convince the audience, or is this representative for what the self-control can do? And so we, as a scientist, we need to do a more solid evaluation. Before I get to numbers, just have a look at the green wave. So the green wave which is established at the moment is the one up there. These are these big bands, and they're really unflexible, you could say. Well, down there we also have green waves, but they're not imposed on flow, but they happen by synchronization and much more flexible. So let's see what comes out here. So a huge improvement for public transportation. Of course, the previous approach couldn't prioritize public transportation, but it's not bad for motorized traffic. There's even a small improvement over there. Calibration with the same empirical data as I said before. And it's also good for pedestrian cyclists, so very nice outcome. It's also good for the environment, and it makes travel times more predictable as well. So why don't we do this? And this is actually currently being done in Dresden, so they have decided for a site, an area in Dresden where they will test this approach, and let's hope all together now that it will convince them and will be a great success and will spread over many cities so we can get rid of a lot of congestion, hopefully. There's another point that I'd like to mention, which contributes a lot to congestion, which has to do with land use, basically where we live. And classically, many urban traffic planners have in mind this constant travel time budget idea. And so if you tell them I can reduce your congestion, they will say, oh, my God, don't do this because it will attract even more cars into the city. And so they want to have congestion because that's painful, you know. They want to punish every single driver, every single citizen who doesn't use public transportation. This is, it's a top-down, close to totalitarian kind of thinking. And the question is it right that if we would reduce congestion, it would make things even worse? And the talk is about induced traffic, and of course the induced traffic does exist. Yeah? But would it basically fill all the freed up capacity that we have created? Or would there be still some improvement? And my claim is there would still be some improvement. And let's look first of all into the travel budget argument that people have often used. First of all, it turns out the travel budget is very different for different modes of transportation. And our further detailed analysis has shown that it very much depends on how much energy, bodily energy, you have to spend on travel activities, how much time you would actually spend on this activity. So it's basically a certain energy budget of our body that we're spending on transportation. But now with GPS data of many cities, we can actually find that the travel time budget is different for different cities, which according to Zahavi's theory shouldn't be the case. Yeah, so it's wrong to say that for hundreds of years we've always spent an hour traveling and we'll always do it. It's just wrong. And actually in Zurich we have a travel time budget of 88 minutes, you know, so even though they're trying to basically improve the situation, they just have a particularly bad outcome. And things are related to housing, in fact. Yeah? Switzerland has a very tense housing market. I think about 99% of the apartments are in use, at least in the agglomerated areas. And this means that even if you wanted to move closer to your job, it will be very difficult for you to find an apartment. And then a certain situation comes in that we know from logistics. And many people are not aware of this because in logistics you have buffers where you store stuff. But getting things out of the buffer takes time, and you sometimes need to get out other things first to find the stuff that you really wanted to get out. So it takes time, and it turns out that if you cannot use 100% of your storage space in the buffer. If you do this, your whole production will not work. If you have a 60% usage of your buffer space, in many cases, it's pretty much like the limit. If you go further, you will start having trouble with your storage and buffer system. So we have actually an explosion of cycling time within the buffer system as we go closer to the 100%, but it's really an enormous increase in the time it takes the closer you go to the 100%. And we have a similar problem over here, and in fact this graph over here shows that housing cost is pretty much the factor that determines travel time budget. There are other factors as well, but it's really one of the main factors. And it's very simple to understand. If you cannot afford to live close to your working place, you have to move out. And that means every day, every single day, you have to spend a lot of time traveling to work and back. And that was the problem. And this is something that apparently is not in everybody's mind. So I'm closing with coming back to the initial question, could we use bottom-up principles also to counter climate change? And I've been thinking about this a little bit. So it would be going away from nations trying, like through a global government, to come up with a solution, to basically build on much smaller units. And to do that through involvement of the many. And in this case, the idea is that the cities might be the right units to work with. If you want to address climate change from the bottom up, the cities are basically the places where most people live, where most of the CO2 is produced, where you can reach most people. So people in cities change their behavior, it has the biggest impact. So if you want to change something, it has to happen in cities. And how do you do this? I mean, if I tell you, you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't use your car, you shouldn't go by plane into your holidays, and so on, and you would say, come on, I want to enjoy my life, and we don't want people to tell us to change our lives. But we like to do things that are fun. And so the question is, can we turn doing something for our environment, for our planet, into something which is fun? And I do think so. Yeah? So the idea is to come up with something like a climate Olympics, because we like to compete. So the idea is basically every 4 years or whatever, cities would engage into this climate Olympics and say, okay, we make a competition for the best technology to insulate houses, to produce energy in the first place, to store it, to also a competition on which city can engage its citizens to buy this technology, to implement it, and all these kind of things. And so it would be fun to compete, university against university in the different cities, and the media featuring all these activities going on. And in the end, after the Olympics, all these new ideas and technologies would be exchanged between the cities to have a new level of best practice. And I think that could be so much more effective, actually. So this is the idea. Kind of turn it into something positive and something ambitious, competitive, something innovative, creative, and see that we can really push the limits in terms of technology, in terms of how we organize our mobility, and do this together. And couldn't that have a much bigger impact on the world? And so, if you think this is a good idea, then spread this idea. Thank you very much.
Dirk, we have time only for one question. Yes.
I have some problems linking the third motivation of improving the environment and improving the efficiency. Because anyway, if you improve the efficiency of traffic, you still have this induced demand, which you can discuss how it goes. But still, you have this induced demand. So at the end, very often this goes at the expense of public transport. So still, you will, as a total amount, you will increase the amount of noise, etc. So I would say increase efficiency, which is fine, but still you should not use as a backing argument that you will make the city more green. This does not go well together.
Still assume that the time that people save, they would spend on more travel. But why is this? I mean, if I look at myself, I'm not spending an hour on traveling every day. I look for an apartment which is close to my workplace, so I don't need to use a car. I use 15 or 20 minutes to get there. I did this because I wanted to have more time to do science. And in the evening, I walk into the city to have some food, and then I go back. I spend maybe 30 minutes in public transportation. I'm just the counter example of everyone who says everyone is traveling an hour. It's just, we should question the axioms. That's what I'm saying. And there is demand. There is demand, of course, to earn money, and there is demand to interact with our friends and family, which is also very important. And the question, how do we organize this? And so maybe it can be organized in a better way.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.